Now then, with a new coalition spat, it seems, every week, it might feel like the general election is just a few weeks away. In actual fact, as we all know, it's not until May 2015. That's because it was agreed and then set in stone when David Cameron and Nick Clegg formed this government. But was that a mistake? And would everyone be better off if we had an election this year? Well, I'm joined now by Tony Blair's former political director, Matthew Doyle, YouGov's head of political research, Joe Twyman, and the Observer's chief political commentator, Andrew Rawnsley. Very good to see you all. Let's discuss. And Andrew, that is the point where I talked there. We're hearing within various departments of them fighting like cats in a sack. The toys are being thrown out of prams on a regular basis.
Yes, I think this was probably inevitable whenever the date of the election, because as it came into view, both the Liberal Democrats and the Conservatives would start to differentiate themselves and be more aggressive about articulating and advertising where they differed from each other. So if you imagine it would only going to be a four-year parliament, a four-year government, I think this process would have just started a bit earlier. I think both parties have to be quite careful in that it's not necessarily a very good advertisement for them if they get into lots and lots of bitter rows. And especially the Liberal Democrats, who've told us there's a great virtue in having a coalition, won't look so virtuous if they spend the next 17 months or so tearing each other's eyes out.
But, I mean, Matthew Doyle, what is to be done? For the next 17 months, if there is this disjuncture within government, can they actually achieve much, or they've just got to sit on their hands and pretend that they're not fighting?
Well, I think this is the challenge. I mean, anyone who's been in government will tell you that if you know what you want to do, then the time flies by. I think the problem with this government is that David Cameron gives every sense of wanting to be Prime Minister, but no sense of knowing why he wants to be Prime Minister. And that's why you've got this sense of him being sort of buffeted by his backbenchers, buffeted by issues that they want to raise rather than he wants to raise, and not having a core agenda that he can bring the national conversation back to. And that's partly why I think the next 16 months will feel like we're treading water. I mean, Joe, on the polling, what do the public think of the current state of the coalition? They quite liked it when it was formed, didn't they? Obviously a novelty.
Yeah, I mean, it really depends on which party you support. And if you're a Conservative or Lib Dem supporter, unsurprisingly, you're pretty keen on the coalition government. And even amongst those supporters, around about two-thirds of those supporters think that they're working together quite well. If you go back to before the election, we tested a whole host of different forms of constitutional reform, and actually fixed-term parliaments were the only change that more than half the electorate supported, and so it's definitely a popular move, and it plays into simplicity, which is something that the public likes, and they don't like the idea of the government of the day, if you like, having this advantage of being able to call when they want it.
So they didn't like the idea of, I mean, effectively, if the government still had control of when they call the election,
well, it's an unfair race.
You get the old cut and run budget, don't you, and off you go.
And also the idea, it's not a fair race when the Prime Minister of the day gets to fire the starting pistol. I'm not sure, actually, we'll ever get away from fixed-term parliaments now, because a Prime Minister would have to go to Parliament and say, I'm going to repeal this legislation to get back this right, this extra perk of being able to call the day of the general election. I mean, Labour hasn't actually said it would repeal this legislation. We may, whether you like them or not, now be stuck with it.
From a public opinion point of view, it's never going to fly, because the idea of anyone standing up and saying, I would like to take back some powers, please. It just,
especially politicians.
Particularly politicians. It just doesn't work.
But I think
that brings you view, Matthew.
I think the slightly counterintuitive thing about having a fixed-term parliament is actually it has added to the lame duck period that you can see a government going into before the general election, because it's on the horizon, we know where it is, and so therefore, by the very nature of knowing when it's going to be, it becomes a focal point. In a way, previously, the sort of day-to-day business of government would continue.
I think Matthew makes a good point. And the other thing it's done on the other side is it's delayed Labour's process of thinking through and telling us what its policies are going to be, which would have happened earlier if you're either uncertain about the day or you think it's going to be a four-year parliament. There's been quite a lot of delay in that.
Joe, I was wondering, could it even add to the public cynicism about politicians in that, I mentioned cut-and-run budgets, when, you could have that budget in the spring and not call the election for a few weeks afterwards. People might think there was a general election coming, but you didn't know it. Now the budget in particular of March 2015 or whatever it is, we know what's coming immediately after that.
Yeah, well, that's true to a certain extent, but at the same time, certainly for the past few elections, people have had a pretty good idea when the elections are going to be. And would things have been any different this time round? Have we not had fixed-term parliaments? Probably not. It probably would have stayed the same course. The other thing worth pointing out is that actually the public don't really pay that much attention to the idea of who's calling it or when it's being called. Instead, it's just something that exists out there. This is when the election will probably be, or this is when the election will definitely be, and that's just something that people.
And Andrew, it brings into question here the type of growth. I was having a discussion with Douglas Carswell about that. He thinks it's the wrong type of growth, that it's consumer and debt-led all over again. You know, there are two arguments about this: that the government needs time for that to bed in and really show the fruits, or that it might turn out to be transitory. There's a big external shock and it all disappears in a year's time.
I mean, I think at the moment both the Tories and the Lib Dems are jolly grateful that they decided to go for a 5-year. 4-year was discussed when they had the coalition negotiations. 5 years, because they've needed the extra time. George Osborne especially grateful, I would have thought. They've needed the extra time in the hope that recovery will take hold. But you're right, it's an interesting risk for them if in fact they are inflating too much of a bubble, especially in housing. One thing they don't want to happen is interest rates to start going up again before the next general election. So if they've overdone the bubble, their timing will be slightly out.
And they must be conscious of the mistake that Gordon Brown made, which was having the opportunity to call an election before the vast majority of, if you like, the bad news had begun, and not taking it. And so that must be playing on their minds. They don't want to be stuck with economic troubles jumping all over their back in the run-up to another election.
But at the moment, I think if you asked any of them, they'd say, we're really glad it's not going to be an election in May of this year, the way things stand at the moment.
But the biggest risk for both of the governing parties is underestimating the public in all of this. I mean, if they think that the public is going to sort of fall for a whole series of symbolic rows that the two parties have, I mean, I think this is one of the times where the politicians need to give the public more credit. They kind of know what's going on, and they either will buy into the Liberal Democrat narrative that this was done because it was necessary, or they will see it as an exercise that hasn't worked.
I mean, what do you personally think, knowing more about the inside? I mean, do you think it is being done for cosmetic reasons? We want to show, particularly from the Lib Dem side, we want to show our supporters that there is differentiation already taking place, or don't they just burst out, don't they, due to frustration?
But you can either do one of two things. You can either make the argument that this is necessary, it's in the national interest, this is what voters wanted at the last election, or you can go for the approach of basically saying all the horrible things that the Tories are doing, and some of them you've managed to round the corners on them, at least, they would claim. You know, you can't do both. You can't do both.
Well, I think they will end up doing both, partly because some of it is genuine, I think, especially on Europe. Tories and Lib Dems clearly disagree. Some of it is a bit stagey. It's a bit like American wrestling. Some people say, you know, they're smashing into each other, but nobody's really hurt at the
real?
end.
Oh, no. Tell me Santa isn't next. Andrew, you know about the inside. I mean, particularly when it comes to, let's say, party conference time, isn't some of that agreed in advance? Don't Nick Clegg and David Cameron sit down and, OK, we'll allow you lot to say that, and you can bash me over this, and we'll bash you over that?
I think there's certainly in the early days, yes, Gary on with the wrestling metaphor, you know, there'd be the pile driver and the slam, but it would all be secretly choreographed beforehand. I think more and more, talking to people on both sides, there are actually genuinely quite a lot of bitterness creeping in, because there is now more ambushing and more attacks that weren't expected and are really getting quite serious occasionally. You know, Lib Dems saying the Tories didn't warn us they were going to do that, and vice versa.
But that comes back to the fundamental that I think even the sort of majority Tory party of the government is giving the sense that it has run out of steam. So therefore, there isn't even something constructive for the two parties to spark off each other for. That's why you're seeing the rows over things like Europe and immigration and so on, in the absence of a substantive debate about, you know, schools or health or public services.
And that's very politically damaging, isn't it, Joe? If you seem to have run out of steam, run out of ideas, you're rudderless.
Yeah, absolutely. People like strong, visionary politicians, even if they perhaps don't think that any are. They also like united parties, and they like the coalition government to be effective. But at the same time, the Lib Dems have to be careful, because they can't be too close to one party or the other, given that the polling is pointing to, at the moment, a very close result in 2015. And so they can't be seen to be jumping into bed with one party, only to find out that they have to be with the others later on.
And on that, I mean, Andrew, what are the big issues to deal with? I mean, the big issue at the moment is migration, immigration, you know, in particular when it comes to the EU. But we're not going to have a referendum until 2017.
Well, if at all. I mean, we'll see.
Exactly. If we get one. The other one is the economy, and you've just kind of got to sit back and hope it...
Well, it's true, but there are a huge issue exposed just in the last few days about further deficit reduction and cuts. George Osborne, I think this is a big stark divide. George Osborne saying the Conservatives would look to find half the money from non-pensioner welfare benefits. Both Labour and the Liberal Democrats saying we don't want to do that. I think that's a very important choice.
Don't you say that and then you have an election because you want that to be the dividing line. You don't want to have to then bring in the cuts. You want to say, OK, do you support them or don't you, Labour?
It's not going to happen. I think you might be panting for one. It's not going to be election. And there has to be pretty extraordinary circumstances where both the Labour and the Conservatives think it's in their interests to have a general election for it to happen any sooner.
But that is the point. That is the point. We kind of glossed over that point. We kind of missed it a bit, Matthew. It's about Labour's policy portfolio. There in particular, as Andrew's pointing out, is you've got one of the so-called dividing lines. And Labour has to now start coming up with those responses pretty urgently and in some detail.
I totally agree, and I think the stuff that we've seen this weekend, for example, from Tristram Hunt on teaching and looking at standards of teaching is exactly the sort of stuff that we need. I think voters are looking for a bit more red meat from the Labour Party, and you're going to see in the coming weeks that stuff coming out. But I think there's also a problem for the Labour Party when it comes to sort of knowing how to handle the Liberal Democrats, that there always has been, which is around the fact that the Liberal Democrats aren't actually one party. You know, the Liberal Democrat Party in the south, where they win votes off the Tories, is very different to the Liberal Democrat appeal in the north, where were winning seats off Labour, and those are certainly seats that Labour expects to pick up at the next election.
I just want to ask you, Joe, about, I mean, you know, is there an appetite, do you feel there, have you done any polling on it for another coalition, whichever parties it may be made up of?
Well, it's really difficult to say because people are judging in a hypothetical context, and so they like the idea of collaborative politics, but sometimes they don't. They're not so supportive of the reality.
OK, and there we must end it, and we must wait to find out for 17 minutes. How long? Darn it. OK, Joe Twyman, Matthew Doyle, Andrew Rawnsley, thank you all very much indeed.